On December 12, 1942, two New Zealand soldiers were frozen in a shallow wadi, exactly 100 yards from a German Afrika Korps encampment. They haven't taken a bath for a complete 3 weeks, and their clothes are caked with sweat, sand, and something even worse. A German cook lorry parks directly beside their hiding spot. They smell like macaroni, a goulash, and gherkins drifting over them. Their stomachs screamed. They can hear German soldiers laughing, talking, walking within arm's reach. But they cannot move, cannot eat their own rations, cannot even shift position. For 18 hours, the enemy troops walked past them 47 times. Not one German detected them. By the time they're relieved, these two dead men have recorded 3,500 enemy vehicles, intelligence that would help turn the tide in North Africa. Their secret was that they literally smelled like corpses rotting in the desert sun. What you're about to discover will disgust you, and then it will make you realize why. It was an absolute genius. Sometimes the most important military innovations come from pure accidents, and in June 1940, a collision in the Mediterranean Sea created what later became the most feared unit in the entire North African campaign. A British convoy was steaming toward various destinations across the Middle East when two troop ships collided in rough seas. Nothing catastrophic, no one died. But the damage forced one ship to limp into Alexandria, Egypt, for emergency repairs. Among the passengers temporarily stranded on the dock was a 44-year-old major in the Royal Engineers named Ralph Alger Bagnold. Bagnold wasn't supposed to be in Egypt at all. His orders had him bound for East Africa, where he'd been assigned to some administrative posting that would waste his unique talents behind a desk. But fate, or a ship's collision, had other plans. Because Ralph Bagnold possessed knowledge that no other officer in the entire British Army had. For a decade before the war, between 1925 and 1935, he had done something that most people considered either insane or pointless. He'd explored the Libyan desert. Not just explored it, he'd mastered it. While other officers were advancing their careers in London or commanding troops in India, Bagnold had been driving Ford Model T trucks across something called the Great Sand Sea, a vast wasteland of dunes that stretched for hundreds of miles, where temperatures could hit 120 degrees in the shade and where there was no shade. He'd led expeditions into territories that no European had ever mapped. He'd learned how to navigate across featureless sand using the sun and stars. He'd figured out how to reduce tire pressure to cross impossible dunes. He'd even invented his own sun compass because regular magnetic compasses went haywire near all the iron ore deposits and vehicle metal. Most importantly, he'd learned how to survive out there, how to make water last, how to repair vehicles with improvised tools when the nearest mechanic was 500 miles away, how to read the desert like other men read books. And now, on June 23, 1940, this walking encyclopedia of desert knowledge walked into the office of General Archibald Wavell, the commander of British Middle East Command. The timing couldn't have been more desperate. France had just fallen. Italy had just declared war on Britain. The Italians controlled Libya, which meant they controlled the entire western flank of Egypt. German forces were preparing to reinforce them, and the British had virtually zero intelligence about what was happening behind enemy lines in that vast desert. They were fighting blind. Wavell listened as Bagnold explained his idea. Long-range patrol units, small teams that could penetrate deep behind Italian lines, we're talking 2,000 miles deep, and gather intelligence. They'd live off minimal supplies, navigate by stars, and radio back enemy positions, troop movements, supply routes, everything the British command desperately needed to know. Most generals would have dismissed this as fantasy, patrols operating 2,000 miles behind enemy lines, surviving for weeks in the Sahara. Wavell had served in the Middle East during World War I. He understood desert warfare. He also understood that Britain had no better options. He gave Bagnold 5 weeks to make it happen. Now Bagnold needed men, but not just any men. He needed a very specific type of soldier, and he found them in the most unlikely place. He needed farmers. Think about that. Britain had professional soldiers, experienced officers, hardened infantry veterans. But Bagnold wanted farmers. Why? Because farmers knew how to fix things. A sheep farmer in New Zealand who's 50 miles from the nearest town can't just call a mechanic when his truck breaks down. He grabs whatever tools he has, improvises, and fixes it himself. That kind of resourcefulness, that self-reliance, that mechanical ingenuity, you can't teach that in basic training. Bagnold approached the 2nd New Zealand Division, which had just arrived in Egypt. He explained the mission. Weeks behind enemy lines, minimal support, high risk, no guarantee of survival. He needed volunteers. More than half the division stepped forward. These weren't elite commandos. These weren't special forces operators trained in a dozen ways to kill. These were guys who'd been shearing sheep and fixing fences just months earlier. Farm boys from the peaceful valleys of New Zealand who were about to become the most effective reconnaissance unit in World War II. Now came the impossible part, getting them ready in 5 weeks. Bagnold scrounged equipment from every corner of Cairo. He chose Chevrolet 30-hundredweight trucks, not because they were fancy, but because they were proven. These trucks had survived commercial use in harsh conditions. He stripped them down, modified them, loaded them with extra fuel tanks, water containers, ammunition racks. He equipped them with his sun compass and army radios that could transmit up to 1,930 kilometers. He obtained Arab headdresses and black agals from the Transjordan Frontier Force stores. Practical protection against sun and sand. For the freezing desert nights, he secured Hebron coats made from shaggy goatskin. The British command thought he was wasting time and resources. A bunch of farmers driving modified commercial trucks into the Sahara, they'd be dead in a week. But they did. Their first operation launched in August 1940. 2 patrols, one led by Bagnold himself, drove deep into Libya. They crossed 4,000 miles of enemy-controlled territory completely undetected. They scouted Italian outposts. They gathered intelligence. They survived the paralyzing heat of day and the freezing cold of night. And they successfully rendezvoused exactly as planned. The skeptics in Cairo were stunned into silence. The question everyone was asking, how? How did a bunch of farmers in commercial trucks accomplish what professional units said was impossible? The answer would turn stomachs across British command. When the first long-range patrol returned to Cairo in September 1940, the officers who greeted them recoiled in horror. Military historian Saul Kelly would later describe the scene. The men of the LRDG patrols were quite a sight on their return to Cairo from a month's trip to Libya. Unwashed, bearded, burnt brown by the sun, and clad in ragged shirts, shorts, and sandals, they had the air about them of a bunch of wild-eyed biblical hermits emerging from their sojourn in the wilderness. That description is being polite. These men looked and smelled like they'd crawled out of a grave. Their uniforms were stiff with salt from weeks of dried sweat. Their skin was cracked and peeling. Their beards were matted with sand and God knows what else. And the smell, a thick biological stench that made hardened officers cover their noses. British Army Command immediately assumed they were witnessing a catastrophic breakdown in military discipline. Medical officers feared they were looking at the advance guard of a disease outbreak. Surely no professional military unit would permit soldiers to reach such a state of filth voluntarily. Hygiene supplies were rushed to the patrol base. Orders were drafted requiring regular bathing. Ralph Bagnold refused them all because what looked like failure was actually genius. And that genius was rooted in something very simple: mathematics. Each man in the long-range desert group received a water ration of 6 pints per day. 6 pints. That's less than 3 liters. Now you're operating in 120-degree heat, and that's the temperature in the shade, which doesn't exist out there. You're doing physical labor, repairing vehicles, digging trucks out of sand, carrying equipment, maintaining weapons. That 6 pints of water had to cover everything. Drinking, obviously the priority, because dehydration kills you in hours. Vehicle cooling, because radiators boil over in that heat, and without water, your truck dies, which means you die. Weapons. Cleaning, because sand gets into every moving part, and jammed weapons are useless weapons. Bathing. That was an impossible luxury. But here's what Bagnold discovered, something that no one had expected. After 2 to 3 weeks without bathing, without using any modern hygiene products, something remarkable happened to the human body. Your chemistry changed. Your sweat stopped smelling like the chemical cocktail of modern life. The oils in your skin mixed with desert dust and sand. Your body started to smell like the desert itself, like dry earth, like ancient stone, like decay and dust and the fundamental smell of that environment. They had accidentally achieved perfect olfactory camouflage. And this mattered more than anyone realized, because every other Allied unit was making a catastrophic mistake. British and American soldiers arrived in North Africa with their standard-issue hygiene kits: soap, deodorant, shaving cream, toothpaste, insect repellent, all the things that made a soldier feel civilized, professional, clean. All the things that, in the desert, turned them into walking scent beacons. Each of these products contains chemical compounds completely alien to the desert environment. Deodorant creates a scent trail that lingers for hours in the humid air near the coast. Insect repellent, particularly the DEET-based formulas, can be detected at extreme distances. American cigarettes, with their distinctive sweet Virginia tobacco, announced patrol positions to any enemy scout within a kilometer. Even toothpaste left a minty chemical signature. In the desert air, these scents could be detected from 500 meters away or more. Italian and German scouts were specifically trained to exploit this. Captured enemy documents confirmed what the LRDG had suspected. British patrols can be located by smell. They carry the scent of chemicals and processed foods that do not exist naturally in the desert. The LRDG eliminated every single marker, 2 to 3 weeks. Before any patrol deployment, troopers stopped using soap entirely. They abandoned deodorant, shaving cream, and commercial toothpaste. They switched from British cigarettes to local tobacco, or they quit smoking entirely. Some even changed their diet, eating indigenous foods including fermented fish sauce, which sounds disgusting, but it altered their body chemistry to be more in line with the local population. By insertion day, they didn't smell human in the way that Europeans smelled human. They smelled like the landscape, like rot and mud and vegetable decay, like death that had been baking in the sun for months. The results were almost supernatural. In later conflicts, Australian SAS units in Vietnam would document Viet Cong patrols passing within 2 meters of concealed positions without detecting anything unusual. The LRDG achieved the same thing, except German soldiers walked past them at arm's length and registered nothing but desert debris. The Arab headdress completed the deception. Every LRDG trooper was issued traditional Arab headgear, the flowing white gutra and the black agal cord that held it in place. On one level, this was purely practical. The fabric protected them from the murderous sun and kept sand out of their eyes, nose, and mouth. But it served multiple other purposes. Psychologically, it helped them blend with the local population. Strategically, from a distance, they looked like Bedouins, desert nomads who traveled the same routes and could appear anywhere without raising suspicion. An Italian scout observing through binoculars might see what looked like another Arab trader moving his goats across the landscape. Combined with the smell, or lack of modern smell, the disguise was perfect. Just another Arab trader with his goats, enemy observers would note in their reports, while those traders were actually recording troop strengths, vehicle counts, and supply movements that would be radioed to British headquarters that same night. But this perfection came at a terrible cost. Skin diseases from polluted water were constant. Heat rash from excessive sweating covered their bodies. Fungal infections thrived in the perpetually damp areas. Armpits, groin, feet. Intestinal diseases were common because perfect food hygiene was impossible. Fever, vomiting, diarrhea became routine parts of patrol life. The dehydration alone should have killed them. 6 pints of water per day in 120-degree heat is borderline survival. When you add fever and diarrhea, which dramatically increase water loss, men should have been dropping like flies, but they didn't. They endured, because the alternative wasn't discomfort. The alternative was detection, and detection meant death. Every British patrol that used normal hygiene products left a scent trail that Italian and German scouts could follow. Those patrols got ambushed. Those soldiers came home in body bags, if they came home at all. The LRDG troopers made their choice, consciously and deliberately. They chose filth over coffins. They chose to smell like corpses rotting in the desert rather than smell like the clean, professional soldiers they'd been trained to be. And they lived when others died. But the smell was just the beginning. Their vehicles would be painted colors so outrageous that British officers filed formal complaints. Pink, purple, pastel green. Their tactics would seem like suicide, lying within 100 yards of enemy camps for days at a time. And their most important mission, the road watch, would require them to remain motionless in shallow scrapes in the ground, lying in their own waste for up to 24 hours at a stretch, while German convoys passed just meters away. The Filth Doctrine was uncomfortable, but what came next would test the absolute limits of human endurance. British Army regulations were very clear about vehicle camouflage. General Order 297 of November 22, 1940, specified that all vehicles in the Middle East were to be painted light stone, officially designated as British Standard Color 61. It was a medium-toned yellow with a brown tinge that veterans called desert yellow. If you wanted to get fancy, you could add contrasting patterns using silver gray, BSC 28, or slate BSC 34. The long-range desert group ignored every word of it, because unlike the bureaucrats writing regulations in Cairo, LRDG patrol commanders actually operated in the desert, and they discovered something that would make British officers file formal complaints. The proper camouflage colors made you stick out like a sore thumb under certain conditions. So, Bagnold gave each patrol commander complete authority to paint their vehicles however they thought best for their specific missions. The results would become legendary and shocking. G Patrol, drawn from the Brigade of Guards, decided they needed something different. They drove their Chevrolet trucks to a helpful paint shop in Cairo and gave the painters an unusual request. The trucks came back sprayed in what one officer described as the most glorious pink, yellow, and green. Pink. Let that sink in for a moment. Elite soldiers driving into combat in bright pink trucks. The officer who ordered it wrote in his diary, "If they did not elude detection from enemy aircraft, they would at least dazzle them." Corporal Inwood, seeing his vehicle for the first time, reportedly said he would not be seen in Cairo driving such a thing. The embarrassment was palpable. When these trucks first rolled out, they looked like they belonged in a circus, not a war. But then they drove into the desert. In the heat and haze of the Sahara, those ridiculous pink trucks became nearly invisible. The pastel color blended perfectly with the shimmering air, the sun-bleached landscape, the dust that hung perpetually in the atmosphere. Enemy aircraft flying overhead couldn't pick them out against the terrain. What looked flashy in Cairo became perfect camouflage 200 miles into Libya. Other patrols experimented with pastel greens, blues, even purples, all colors that seemed absurd until you saw them in their actual environment. In rocky regions, patrols used slate blue and gray. Some trucks were painted to deliberately mimic German or Italian vehicles from a distance, buying precious seconds in an encounter. No two patrols looked the same, and that diversity was intentional. But camouflage was only part of their genius. The real revolution was in navigation. Bagnold's sun compass was one of those inventions so simple and so brilliant that you wonder why no one thought of it earlier. Standard magnetic compasses went haywire in the desert. The iron ore deposits in the soil threw off readings. The metal in the trucks created interference. You could be 20 degrees off course and not know it, until you were hopelessly lost. Bagnold's sun compass used the angle of the sun's shadow to determine direction. It was accurate to within 1 degree. You could navigate across completely featureless sand seas, endless dunes with no landmarks, no vegetation, nothing but sand and sky, and hit your target precisely. At night, they used star navigation with the same precision. These New Zealand farmers, most of whom had never been more than 50 miles from home before the war, learned to read the heavens like ancient mariners. They created detailed maps of territories that had never been charted by Europeans. And they could guide other units, including the newly formed Special Air Service, to targets 1,200 miles behind enemy lines with perfect accuracy. But their most important contribution wasn't the raids. It was something far less glamorous and far more critical: the road watch. Between March and July 1942, the LRDG maintained continuous surveillance of the Via Balbia, the coastal road from Tripoli to Benghazi, over 400 miles of paved highway that was Rommel's entire supply lifeline. Every tank, every truck, every can of fuel that reached the Afrika Korps traveled that road. And the LRDG was watching. They ran a 3-patrol rotation system with mechanical precision. One patrol was on watch for 7 to 10 days. Another patrol was en route from Siwa Oasis, their base about 30 miles from the Libyan border, to relieve them. The 3rd patrol was returning to Siwa for debriefing and rest. For 5 months straight, the LRDG maintained this rotation, missing only 15 days during the entire period. Think about what that means. In some of the harshest terrain on Earth, with the enemy actively hunting them, they achieved 97% operational uptime. The actual mechanics of the road watch were brutally simple and brutally hard. The patrol would position themselves about 5 miles from the road. Their trucks would be parked 2 miles back from the observation post, carefully, camouflaged using nets, whatever local foliage existed, usually just scrub brush and sand. The vehicles had to be invisible from the air because German reconnaissance planes flew constant patrols. Then, before dawn each day, 2 men would move forward to an observation post about 350 yards from the road. They'd dig shallow scrapes in the ground, just deep enough to provide minimal concealment, and cover themselves with whatever materials they could find. Thorn bushes, sand-colored cloth, anything that would break up their outline. Then they'd wait. During daylight hours, they'd record everything. Vehicle types, vehicle numbers, troop strengths, equipment being transported, even the bumper numbers if they could see them clearly enough. At night, they'd move closer, to about 30 yards from the road, and identify vehicles by sound and silhouette. The rumble of a tank was different from a truck. An empty truck sounded different from a loaded one. They learned to count entire convoys. In complete darkness, they recorded everything, including details that seemed insignificant. Were the soldiers singing? That meant morale was high. Were they silent and trudging? That meant they were exhausted or demoralized. These tiny observations, aggregated over weeks, gave British intelligence an unprecedented window into the enemy's state of mind. December 12, 1942. Captain Timpson and Trooper Welsh were dropped off several miles from the coast road to establish a road watch position. They scouted the area and found a problem. The Germans were everywhere. Every piece of reasonable cover was already occupied by enemy units. The only unoccupied space was a steep-sided wadi that flattened out near the road. There were a few small mounds sparsely covered with thorn bushes, barely enough concealment to hide a dog, let alone 2 grown men with equipment. They had no choice. They positioned themselves and waited for dawn. Daybreak brought their nightmare to life. German vehicles pulled off the road barely 100 yards from their position. An entire unit was making camp. And then, because the universe has a cruel sense of humor, a cook lorry parked directly next to their hideout. For the next 18 hours, Timpson and Welsh lay absolutely motionless. They could hear every word of German conversation. They could hear the cook discussing the menu, macaroni, goulash, gherkins. They could smell it cooking, that rich, hot smell of real food being prepared just meters away. Their own rations consisted of tinned bully beef, which they couldn't eat because opening a tin would make noise. They couldn't move to retrieve their canteens. They couldn't shift position even slightly. And they couldn't relieve themselves properly. For 18 hours, these 2 men lay in their own filth while German soldiers walked past them repeatedly, sometimes within arm's reach, never detecting their presence. When they were finally relieved and made it back to the patrol base, they had recorded 3,500 westbound vehicles. That intelligence helped British command predict German movements with stunning accuracy. Supply convoys that had been logged heading west showed up at the front lines exactly when and where the LRDG data suggested they would. This happened again and again. On March 21, 1942, R1 Patrol found themselves in an even worse situation. They were on road watch when an enemy convoy of 27 vehicles and approximately 200 men stopped for the night, between the observation post and the trucks. The watchers were cut off from their only means of escape. They spent the entire night frozen in position, listening to German soldiers laughing and talking just meters away. At dawn, the convoy moved on, completely unaware they'd camped within spitting distance of British troops. Another patrol reported an incident so surreal it seems impossible. An enemy soldier stepped directly onto a trooper's boot. The German looked down, saw what appeared to be just desert, debris, and walked away. He never knew he'd placed his full weight on a human being who could have killed him instantly. Every vehicle count, every observation, every tiny detail was radioed back to Siwa headquarters, which transmitted it to Cairo. By the time enemy forces reached the front lines, British command knew they were coming. Tank movements were predicted days in advance. Supply shortages were detected before they affected German combat capability. Even troop morale was assessed based on whether convoys were singing or silent. General Bernard Montgomery would later say, "Without the LRDG, operations in North Africa would have been impossible. But watching wasn't enough. The intelligence was invaluable, yes. But sometimes the situation called for something more direct. Sometimes they had to strike. And when they did, the violence was surgical, shocking, and absolutely devastating." On the night of September 13th, 1942, the largest combined Special Forces operation of the North African campaign was about to unfold. The target was Bars, a town and airfield complex in northeastern Libya that served as a major Axis logistics hub. The Germans and Italians considered it untouchable. It was over 400 miles behind the front lines, surrounded by their own territory, heavily defended. They were about to learn a terrible lesson about assumptions. 3 elite units converged on Bars that night: the Long-Range Desert Group, the Special Air Service, and the Royal Marine Commandos. Different specialties, different training, but all guided through 400 miles of enemy-controlled desert by LRDG navigators who could find their way through a sandstorm at midnight. The LRDG had spent weeks planning the approach routes. They'd studied every wadi, every escarpment, every piece of terrain that could hide a convoy of trucks moving through Axis territory. They'd timed the movement to coincide with German shift changes, when observation was most lax. They'd calculated fuel requirements down to the gallon and water consumption down to the pint. As night fell, the 3 forces struck simultaneously with surgical precision. The LRDG hit ground targets, fuel storage, ammunition dumps, vehicle parks. The SAS went after the aircraft on the airfield, placing explosive charges on planes that the Germans thought were safely parked 400 miles from the enemy. The Royal Marine Commandos secured the perimeter and cut communications lines, ensuring that calls for help wouldn't reach German command for precious minutes. The chaos was instant and total. German officers ran from their quarters, trying to understand what was happening. Italian gunners scrambled to their anti-aircraft positions, but the attack was coming from the ground, from inside their own perimeter. Radio operators frantically tried to reach higher command. "We're under attack. Large force. How did they get here?" Nobody had an answer. By the time the sun rose, 35 aircraft were destroyed, blown apart, or burned to skeletal frames. Fuel dumps were still burning, sending black smoke thousands of feet into the air. Supply warehouses that had held ammunition, spare parts, and rations were rubble. Axis casualties were significant, though exact numbers were never confirmed because the attacking forces didn't stick around to count bodies. They melted back into the desert before German reinforcements could arrive, guided out by the same LRDG navigators who'd brought them in. The round trip was over 800 miles through hostile territory. Not a single Allied vehicle was lost. Operation Caravan became the LRDG's most famous offensive action, but it was just one of hundreds of missions that earned them a nickname they wore with pride: the Libyan Taxi Service. Because while the raids made headlines, the LRDG's real job was transportation and guidance. They moved people and gathered intelligence. They guided SAS teams to targets that conventional navigation would never reach. They transported British intelligence agents behind enemy lines and picked them up weeks later from predetermined coordinates. They delivered Arab resistance fighters to strategic positions and evacuated them when operations went sideways. They rescued crashed RAF pilots from the deep desert. They extracted Allied operatives who'd been gathering intelligence in enemy-controlled towns. They could navigate through territories that no one else could even map. The partnership with the Special Air Service became legendary. David Stirling founded the SAS in November 1941, 18 months after the LRDG was already operating. Stirling had vision and audacity. He wanted to conduct raids deep behind enemy lines, hitting Axis airfields and destroying aircraft on the ground. But he had a problem. He didn't know how to get his men 300, 400, 500 miles into the desert and back out again. The LRDG did. Sterling approached, Bagnold, and what followed was one of the most effective military partnerships of the war. The LRDG taught SAS troopers desert navigation, vehicle maintenance, and survival techniques. Then they started conducting joint operations, with the LRDG handling transportation and navigation, while the SAS provided the combat firepower. The results devastated Axis operations. In December 1941, Paddy Mayne, who would become one of the SAS's most legendary figures, led a raid on Wadi Tamit airfield. The LRDG delivered his demolition teams 350 miles behind enemy lines on a moonless night, hitting the coordinates so precisely that Mayne's men walked straight onto the airfield perimeter without wasting time searching for it. They destroyed dozens of aircraft and were back in their trucks before German security even understood what had happened. Raid after raid followed the same pattern. The LRDG would deliver the SAS like a precision instrument, wait at a predetermined rally point, and extract them after the operation. The casualty rates were remarkably low for how deep they operated. In fact, during their first 2 years in North Africa, the LRDG suffered only 16 men killed and 24 missing. For a unit conducting operations hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, those numbers were almost miraculous. Conventional units operating in standard combat conditions often took more casualties in a single week. But when the desert campaign ended and the LRDG moved to new theaters, Italy, Greece, the Balkans, the learning curve was brutal. The terrain was completely different. Mountains instead of sand, forests instead of empty horizons, villages and civilians instead of vast uninhabited spaces. And the Germans weren't stretched thin across a 1,000-mile front anymore. They were concentrated, alert, and hunting. During operations in Greece, the LRDG lost 41 men killed in a single month. Another 50 were captured. The parachute insertions that worked reasonably well in open desert became nightmares in mountainous terrain with unpredictable winds. Their tactics had to evolve fast, and that evolution cost lives, but even the enemy recognized their effectiveness. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, arguably Germany's finest battlefield commander, made a statement that became the LRDG's ultimate validation. The long-range desert group caused us more damage than any other British unit of equal strength. Coming from Rommel, that wasn't just praise. It was a professional assessment from a man who understood desert warfare better than almost anyone. Afrika Korps commanders issued specific warnings about the LRDG. Intelligence briefings treated them differently than other Allied units. They were recognized as an exceptional threat that required unique tactical responses. Back home in New Zealand and Britain, the press loved them. Headlines screamed about desert pirates and modern outlaws. Photographs of bearded men in Arab headdress created a swashbuckling romantic image. Lawrence of Arabia meets Robin Hood, striking from the wastes to confound the enemy. The reality was far less romantic. The reality was months of boredom, punctuated by moments of terror, days spent lying motionless in observation posts, recording vehicle numbers while flies crawled across your face and you couldn't move to brush them away. Hours spent repairing vehicles that had broken down in the middle of nowhere, improvising solutions with whatever materials you had. And then, maybe a few minutes of absolute violence when you hit a target or got spotted by enemy patrol. Then back to the silence, back to the waiting. The survival stories became legendary within the unit. Trooper R.J. Morse was wounded and separated from his patrol during a German attack. He walked 210 miles through the desert alone before being picked up by another LRDG patrol. He survived on minimal water, desert knowledge, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to die. Another patrol repaired a cracked crankcase using a mixture of sand and chewing gum. It held long enough to get them back to base. When attacked by aircraft, patrols would deliberately drive into sandstorms where visibility was zero, accepting the risk of crashing into unseen obstacles because it was better than being strafed. Some even drove into the dust clouds kicked up by exploding bombs because the Stuka pilots couldn't see through their own weapons' effects. Improvisation wasn't just a skill. It was the difference between survival and death. By May 1943, the North African campaign was over. the Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. The LRDG had operated behind enemy lines for 1,035 of the 1,050 days since their first patrol. They'd missed only 15 days and nearly 3 years of continuous operations. But their war wasn't finished. What came next would test them beyond anything the desert had thrown at them. Different terrain, different enemies, different tactics. The LRDG was about to discover that being invisible in the Sahara didn't mean you'd be invisible in the mountains of Greece or the forests of Yugoslavia. The desert had been their proving ground. The Mediterranean would be their crucible. In May 1943, the Axis surrendered in Tunisia. The Desert War was over. For most units, this meant rotation home, rest, maybe reassignment to another theater. For the long-range desert group, it meant learning an entirely new way to fight. They were shipped to Lebanon for retraining in mountain warfare. Think about what that meant. These men had spent 3 years becoming the absolute masters of desert operations. They knew sand the way sailors know water. They could navigate by stars across featureless dunes, repair vehicles in 120-degree heat, and survive on 6 pints of water a day. They were the best desert operators the world had ever seen. Now they had to learn cold weather operations. The equipment was completely different. Desert trucks were stripped down for weight and heat management. Mountain operations required different vehicles, different gear. They needed warmer clothing. The Hebron goatskin coats that had been perfect for freezing desert nights weren't enough for alpine cold. They needed different navigation techniques because sun compasses don't help much when you're in forested valleys where you can't see the sky. And they needed to learn something they'd never done before: parachute jumping. Their new mission covered the Greek islands, Italy, and the Balkans. German forces occupied hundreds of islands in the Aegean. Mainland Europe presented terrain that was the opposite of everything they knew. They were transitioning from desert specialists to all-terrain phantoms, and the learning curve would be written in blood. The Aegean Islands campaign tested them immediately. Greek islands dotted the Mediterranean, each one potentially holding German observation posts, supply dumps, or small garrisons. The LRDG was tasked with reconnaissance and raiding operations that required different thinking. In the desert, you could see the enemy coming from miles away. On an island, the enemy was concentrated, close, and had nowhere to retreat. The attack. On Levita, also called Levita, island became one of their most challenging operations. Captain Olivi commanded 48 men tasked with capturing Mount Vardia, the high ground that overlooked the island's harbor. Control that position, and you controlled the island. The landing was initially unopposed. They came ashore quietly from motor launches under cover of darkness. But then the launches opened fire on shore targets, announcing their presence to every German within hearing distance. The element of surprise evaporated. As dawn broke, German seaplanes began taking off from the harbor. Trooper Lloyd Dole, positioned on the ridge with a Bren gun, opened fire on the aircraft as they taxied for takeoff. He nearly downed one. Witnesses saw it struggle after his burst tore through the fuselage, but it managed to gain altitude and escape after a delay. The Germans now knew exactly where the LRDG was positioned. What followed was a grinding fight utterly unlike anything they'd experienced. In the desert, in Libya, if you got spotted, you drove away. The desert was vast and empty. On an island, there was nowhere to go. You either held your position or you died. Italy brought even worse challenges. In June 1944, several LRDG patrols parachuted north of Rome with a specific mission: reconnaissance of roads and bridges ahead of the Allied advance. Intelligence needed to know which routes could support heavy armor, which bridges were intact, where German units were positioned, and how strong those positions were. Most patrols were dropped in the wrong locations. This wasn't incompetence. It was the reality of 1944 navigation technology, combined with difficult terrain and weather. Parachute drops that might have worked reasonably well in the open desert became disasters in mountainous terrain with unpredictable winds. Several patrols landed far too close to German positions. Some landed directly in the middle of enemy-occupied areas. Captain Ashley Greenwood's patrol was dropped so far off target that they weren't even on their own maps. As Greenwood floated down under his parachute, he could see truck headlights moving along roads below. German trucks, exactly where his patrol wasn't supposed to be. After landing, Greenwood and his men tried to complete their mission, but German forces were too concentrated. Most of the patrol was captured. Greenwood himself, along with one other man, managed to evade capture, but they were separated. Greenwood made his way south toward the Allied lines and found himself at Lake Trasimene, where the two armies faced each other across the water. He crawled through the reeds along the lakeshore, literally between the opposing forces, until he reached British positions. The sentries who found him thought he was a German infiltrator at first. He was so filthy and exhausted that he barely looked human. The brutal truth was becoming clear. Desert tactics didn't work in mountains. Forests provided different concealment. What had kept them invisible in the Sahara, lack of chemical smell, Arab headdress, vehicle camouflage, meant nothing in European terrain. Villages complicated everything because civilian populations could, and did, report their movements to German authorities. Partisan groups added another layer of complexity. Some were helpful, some were suspicious, and all of them had their own agendas. German responses were faster and more organized. In the desert, Axis forces were stretched across hundreds of miles. In Greece and Italy, they were concentrated. Reinforcements arrived in minutes instead of hours. Communication lines were intact instead of non-existent. The casualties mounted with shocking speed. The LRDG lost more men in their first month in Greece than they had in 2 years in North Africa. 41 killed, 50 captured. These were catastrophic losses for a unit that never numbered more than 350 men total. But they adapted, again. The same qualities that had made them successful in the desert, resourcefulness, mental toughness, ability to learn and innovate, carried them through the new challenges. They became mountain ghosts the way they'd been desert ghosts. Different tactics, different techniques, but the same fundamental approach. Patience, intelligence gathering, surgical strikes, then disappear. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, LRDG leadership made a request that showed just how dedicated these men were. They asked the War Office to transfer them to the Pacific Theater. They wanted to fight the Japanese in terrain they thought would suit their skill set: jungles, islands, difficult navigation. The War Office declined. Other commando units were already operating in Asia. The LRDG wasn't needed there. In August 1945, the Long-Range Desert Group was disbanded. 5 years of existence. Only 5 months when they weren't on active operations. They were probably the most cost-effective special forces unit in military history. The statistics tell an incredible story. Never more than 350 men total, yet they covered distances equivalent to the size of India. Over 200 missions across multiple theaters. They operated 1,035 out of 1,050 days in North Africa, missing only 15 days in nearly 3 years. They guided the SAS on dozens of raids. Their intelligence influenced every major battle in the Desert Campaign. The supply predictions they radioed from the Road Watch enabled British planning that culminated in Montgomery's victory at El Alamein. Their legacy extended far beyond their own operations. The LRDG was the first British Special Forces unit. They predated the SAS by 18 months. They proved that small units with specialized training could achieve strategic impact far beyond their numbers. They demonstrated that unconventional tactics could defeat conventional forces. They literally invented long-range vehicle patrolling as a military doctrine. Modern special forces, the British SAS, American Rangers, and Navy SEALs, the Green Berets, all incorporate techniques that the LRDG pioneered. Desert warfare doctrine taught at military academies today is based on lessons the LRDG learned in 1940 to 1943. Their methods are still studied, still taught, still relevant 8 decades later. The New Zealand and Australian connections run deep. Both countries formed their own SAS regiments after the war, and both credited LRDG experience as foundational to their special forces culture. The techniques passed through generations of soldiers. Vietnam-era Australian SAS tactics, the smell discipline, the extreme patience in movement, the mastery of concealment, were direct echoes of LRDG methods. The jungle ghosts who operated in Southeast Asia learned from the desert ghosts who'd perfected those techniques in North Africa. Yet, despite all this, the LRDG faded from public consciousness after the war. During the 1940s, they were more famous than the SAS. The wartime generation knew their exploits well, but post-war, as veterans returned to civilian life and memories faded, the LRDG became a footnote. Meanwhile, the SAS exploded into public awareness after the 1980 Iranian embassy siege in London, where SAS operators conducted a dramatic hostage rescue broadcast live on television. The LRDG remained largely unknown until recently. Books like Gavin Mortimer's Histories and Documentaries slowly began restoring recognition. The 2022 BBC series SAS Rogue Heroes mentioned them, introducing a new generation to their story. The LRDG Preservation Society works tirelessly to keep the history alive, publishing research, connecting veterans' families, and ensuring these men aren't forgotten. The human cost deserves acknowledgement. Final casualty counts remain partially classified, but we know the documented numbers: 16 killed and 24 missing in North Africa, 41 killed and 50 captured in just 1 month in Greece. The full Mediterranean theater losses are unknown. Diseases, exposure, and accidents went uncounted in official statistics. The psychological toll was never measured. These were men who went weeks without bathing, who lay in their own waste for days while watching enemies pass meters away, who walked hundreds of miles after being separated from their patrols, who improvised survival using sand and chewing gum. What does that do to a person? How do you process lying motionless for 18 hours while smelling enemy food cooking, knowing that one twitch means death? We'll never fully know. In 2008, historians Brendan O'Carroll, Kuno Gross, and Roberto Chiavetto traveled to Gebel Sharif in southern Libya, searching for physical evidence of LRDG operations. They found 3 Chevrolet trucks abandoned in 1941 after the unit's first encounter with the Italian Auto Sahariana, Italy's answer to the LRDG. The trucks were still there, preserved by the desert's dryness. Bullet holes pocked the metal. Equipment and personal items remained scattered inside and around the vehicles. It was a time capsule of their methods. You could see the modifications, the camouflage patterns, the way gear was stowed. Photographs taken in 2010 show the trucks gradually being reclaimed by the sand, the desert slowly erasing evidence of the men who had mastered it. So, here's the final word on the long-range desert group. They were farmers who became phantoms. They chose filth over detection and endured disease over comfort. They lay motionless while enemies walked past them. They smelled like death and dealt it with precision. They were called pirates, outlaws, and hermits by people who didn't understand what they were seeing. But they were actually the most professional soldiers in the theater. The disgusting secret wasn't just about survival. It was about absolute calculated superiority achieved through unconventional means. And it helped win a war.